In 1942, you could purchase a one-way train ticket to Auschwitz. The fare was 4 pfennigs per kilometer. Children under 10 traveled at half price. Children under 4 traveled free. The Deutsche Reichsbahn, Germany's national railway, classified this service under group travel discounts for parties of more than 400 passengers. The paperwork was immaculate. The invoices were paid on time, and the trains, almost always, ran on schedule. The Holocaust was not only an act of ideology, it was an act of administration. What made the murder of 6 million people possible was not simply hatred. Hatred is as old as civilization itself. What made it possible was a system. A bureaucratic, logistical, continent-spanning machine built from filing cabinets and timetables, from memoranda and rubber stamps, from men who wore not SS insignia but the uniform of a railway clerk. When historians examine the mechanisms of the Holocaust, they often focus on the camps themselves, the architecture of death, the hierarchy of command. These things matter. But there is a prior question that is rarely asked with sufficient seriousness. How did the victims get there? The answer is deceptively ordinary. They took the train. Between 1941 and 1945, the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German Imperial Railway, transported millions of human beings to killing centers across occupied Europe. From the ghettos of Warsaw, from the boulevards of Paris, from the villages of Greece and the apartment buildings of Amsterdam, people were loaded into freight cars and moved eastward with the mechanical precision of a postal service delivering letters. This is not a story about monsters operating outside the bounds of civilization. It is a story about civilization itself, about what an advanced, modern, industrialized nation chose to do with its most sophisticated infrastructure. The railway did not pull the trigger. It did not operate the gas chambers. But without the railway, none of it was operationally possible. The camps were distant. The victims were scattered across thousands of miles. The only force capable of bridging that geography with the required speed and volume was the most powerful transportation network in Europe. This is the story of that network, and of the men who kept it running. To understand how the railways became instruments of genocide, you first have to understand what they meant to Germany and to modern warfare itself. The railroad was the defining technology of the 19th century. Before it, armies moved at the pace of a horse or a man on foot. Supply chains stretched thin. Mobilization took weeks. Geography was destiny. But the locomotive changed everything. Suddenly, a nation could move tens of thousands of soldiers fully armed, fed, and equipped hundreds of miles in a matter of days. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was decided, in no small part, by Prussia's superior use of railways. The German General Staff absorbed that lesson and never forgot it. By the time the First World War began in 1914, German military doctrine treated the railway network as a strategic weapon, equal in importance to artillery. The Schlieffen Plan, the grand blueprint for a two-front war, was essentially a railway timetable expressed as military strategy. It depended on moving 1 million men west by train within 18 days of mobilization. The precision required was extraordinary, and the German Railway Administration delivered it. The Weimar Republic inherited this infrastructure in defeat, battered but intact. When the National Socialists came to power in 1933, they found a tool of remarkable power waiting for them. Adolf Hitler understood railways in a way that was almost aesthetic. He had grown up in an era of railway expansion. He admired their scale, their order, their capacity for transformation. Under the Third Reich, the Deutsche Reichsbahn was not privatized, not decentralized, it was centralized further, brought under state authority, rationalized, expanded. By 1939, it employed more than 500,000 people and operated one of the densest rail networks on Earth. When the war began, the Reichsbahn became the circulatory system of the German war machine. It moved panzers to Poland. It supplied the invasion of France. It carried fuel and ammunition to the Eastern Front in quantities that staggered logistics planners. The Reich's ability to wage war on multiple fronts simultaneously depended almost entirely on its ability to move material by rail. But logistics is a discipline that does not distinguish between cargo types. A railway that can move a tank division can also move a population. The infrastructure is the same. The scheduling methods are the same. The billing procedures are the same. The men doing the work are, largely, the same. This is the detail that gets lost in popular accounts of the Holocaust. The deportation trains were not a parallel, secret system. They ran on the same tracks, administered by the same bureaucracy, managed according to the same operational principles as every other train in Nazi Germany. When a deportation was ordered, the request went through standard railway channels. Capacity was assessed, routes were planned, timetables were drawn up. It was, from a purely administrative standpoint, indistinguishable from arranging a troop transfer or a coal shipment. That normalization, that seamless integration of mass murder into everyday institutional routine, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire operation. The bureaucratic mechanism that made the deportation trains possible had a name: the Sonderzüge, special trains. The term itself is almost banal. Sonderzüge were a normal category within the German railway system. They designated trains that operated outside the regular timetable, arranged for specific purposes. Military transports were Sonderzüge. Trains carrying industrial equipment were Sonderzüge. And beginning in the autumn of 1941, trains carrying Jewish men, women and children to killing centers in the East were also designated Sonderzüge, the same administrative category. The same scheduling forms, the same route request procedures. At the center of this operation was a man named Adolf Eichmann, the SS officer tasked with coordinating the logistics of what the Nazis called the final solution. Eichmann was not a fanatic in the theatrical sense. He was an organizer, an administrator. His talent was not cruelty, it was coordination. He understood that moving millions of people across a continent required not brutality but paperwork, and he was extraordinarily good at paperwork. Eichmann's office negotiated with the Deutsche Reichsbahn through a specialist in the railway bureaucracy named Franz Nowak, who handled the actual scheduling work. Their correspondence was professional in tone. They discussed capacity, routing, and scheduling conflicts with the efficiency of logistics managers planning a supply chain. The language they used was the language of transport administration. The cargo, of course, was human beings. The railway itself was managed at the operational level by a department within the Reichsbahn called Directorate East General Direktion der Ostbahn, which oversaw the rail network in occupied Poland. This was the nerve center through which most of the deportation trains were routed, because most of the killing centers, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, were located in occupied Polish territory. The process of arranging a deportation followed a recognizable bureaucratic sequence. First, an order would originate from the SS or the Gestapo, identifying a target population in a specific city or region. That order would travel up and across the administrative hierarchy until it reached Eichmann's office, which would then submit a formal transport request to the Reichsbahn. The railway would assess available rolling stock, consult its timetable for route availability, and issue a schedule. The local railway authority in the origin city would then be notified, and the process of assembling the transport would begin. The trains themselves were almost universally composed of freight wagons, specifically the standard German goods wagon known as the Güterwagen. These cars were designed for cargo, not people. They had no seats, no sanitation, no ventilation beyond narrow slats in the wooden walls. In summer, the temperature inside them could reach lethal levels. In winter, the cold was equally deadly. Standard capacity for a goods wagon was listed at 8 horses or 40 soldiers with full equipment. Deportation, transport orders, routinely specified loadings of 80, 90, 100 persons per wagon. The journey from Paris or Amsterdam to Auschwitz took several days. The journey from Salonika in Greece took 11 days. From the Romanian city of Iași, the journey in sealed freight cars was so brutal that thousands died in transit before the trains reached their destinations. The Reichsbahn charged for each deportation by the kilometer, using its standard group travel rate, a third-class passenger fare applied to the total headcount, with the return leg waived, since there would be no return passengers. The billing went to the SS. The SS paid from funds that had been confiscated from the deportees themselves. The railway made a profit. The accounting was meticulous. What is worth pausing on, and this is something historians have debated at length, is the question of institutional knowledge. Did the railway workers, the schedulers, the station managers, the conductors and engineers know what these trains were carrying and where they were going? The evidence strongly suggests that most did. The conditions in the wagons were visible on the platforms. The cries from within the sealed cars were audible. The fact that trains departed full and returned empty was a matter of operational record. Station workers at transit hubs across occupied Europe observed these transports regularly. Some were disturbed by what they saw. Some were indifferent. Very few raised formal objections, and fewer still refused their assignments. This is where the history of the deportation trains intersects with one of the most consequential psychological insights to emerge from the study of the Holocaust, the concept that historian Christopher Browning examined in his study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, and which philosopher Hannah Arendt had earlier framed in her coverage of the Eichmann trial, that the men who administered and enabled mass murder were not, in the main, sadists or true-believing fanatics. They were ordinary people operating within institutional structures that normalized their participation. The railway worker who drove the train to Auschwitz was not, in most cases, a committed Nazi ideologue. He was a man who had a job, who followed orders, who operated within an institutional culture that discouraged questioning, and who told himself, if he told himself anything, that his role was limited, that he was merely the transport and not the destination. Here is a question worth sitting with, and one that I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts on in the comments below. Not as a provocation, but as a serious historical and moral inquiry. At what point does participation in a system become complicity in that system's outcomes? Not the architects, not the commanders, but the man who schedules the timetable, the clerk who processes the billing, the engineer who drives the locomotive. They did not design the Holocaust. They did not give the orders. But without their daily, routine, professional cooperation, the machinery could not have functioned. How do we think about moral responsibility when it is distributed across thousands of individuals, each performing only one small piece of an enormous atrocity? It is one of the most important questions the 20th century left us, and it remains entirely unresolved. The scale of the Reichsbahn's role was extraordinary. Between 1942 and 1944, at the height of the deportations, thousands of special trains were run. Historian Raoul Hilberg, whose exhaustive scholarship on the Holocaust remains foundational, estimated that the transportation of Jews alone required the equivalent of several years of full-time rolling stock deployment. This was not a marginal operation. It was a major logistical undertaking that competed sometimes directly with the Wehrmacht's own transport requirements. There were points during the war particularly during the military crisis on the Eastern Front in 1944, when German army commanders formally requested that deportation trains be suspended to free up railway capacity for troop movements. Their requests were denied. Heinrich Himmler and the SS insisted that the deportations take priority. Adolf Hitler backed them. The killing was not to be interrupted for the sake of military necessity. In that decision, in that explicit statement of institutional priority, you can see the full ideological character of the regime laid bare. The statistics are beyond comprehension in any human sense. So let us try to approach the human reality through the particular rather than the aggregate. In July 1942, the German authorities in Warsaw issued orders for the mass deportation of the ghetto's population. By that point, more than 400,000 Jews had been confined within the ghetto's walls, a population larger than many European capitals, compressed into a few square kilometers, surviving on starvation rations under conditions of deliberate brutalization. The deportations were announced not as killings because the destination was not announced as a death camp, but as resettlement. People were told they were being transferred east for labor. Many were skeptical. Some had heard rumors about what resettlement meant. But the uncertainty was itself a tool. When the alternative to boarding the train was being shot in the street, the train represented, at least, the possibility of survival. The Umschlagplatz, the assembly point in Warsaw where deportees were held before being loaded onto trains, became a space of agonizing decision. Families who had been separated for weeks were briefly reunited there. Mothers held children they had not seen for months. Men who had obtained work papers that might exempt them from deportation faced the choice of using those papers to save themselves alone or staying with family members who had no such protection. The decisions made in those hours under extreme duress, with incomplete information and no good options, were the kinds of decisions that broke people. The trains loaded at the Umschlagplatz departed for Treblinka, roughly 60 miles northeast of Warsaw. The journey took several hours. There was no water provided. In the July heat, people inside sealed freight cars suffered rapidly from dehydration and suffocation. By the time the trains arrived, many passengers had already died. Between July and September of 1942, approximately 265,000 people were transported from Warsaw to Treblinka on these trains. In that period, Treblinka was not a labor camp or a concentration camp in the conventional sense. It was a pure extermination facility. The trains arrived, the passengers were unloaded. Within hours, the overwhelming majority were dead. The transport records survive because the Reichsbahn maintained them. The invoices were filed. The schedules were archived. The numbers of passengers were logged because the billing was calculated by headcount. In the clinical language of railway administration, the death of 265,000 human beings is preserved as a series of transport orders, route confirmations, and financial statements. There are individual accounts, to testimony from the small number of survivors, from railway workers, from residents of towns along the routes who watched the sealed trains pass through. A Polish woman living near the Treblinka line recalled in post-war testimony that in summer 1942 she could smell the trains before she could see them. A former SS guard at Treblinka described the arrival of transports with a detachment that itself speaks to the normalization of atrocity. A survivor of the Warsaw deportations recalled that what haunted her most was not the violence, but the orderliness, the fact that it all proceeded according to schedule, that the trains departed at the stated times, that the whole machinery of murder had the texture of routine. That texture of routine. That is the detail that most demands our attention, because it tells us something about how ordinary institutions can be turned to extraordinary purposes without necessarily being transformed. The routine persisted. The institution adapted. The deportation system did not remain static. It evolved, expanded, and reached across the entirety of occupied Europe with increasing efficiency. In the early phase of the deportations, 1941 into early 1942, the primary targets were Jews in the occupied Soviet territories and in the general government of occupied Poland. Mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, operated behind the advancing front lines, conducting mass shootings. These methods were brutal but, from the perspective of the SS, inefficient and psychologically damaging to the perpetrators. The decision to industrialize the killing, to build fixed extermination facilities and transport victims to them, was in part a response to these logistical and psychological constraints. As the killing centers became operational through 1942, the railway system expanded to serve them. Routes were surveyed and approved. Agreements were negotiated with the railway authorities of occupied and collaborating nations, France's SNCF, the Dutch railways, the railways of Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Greece, and others. Each national railway authority participated in the deportations from their territory, operating under different levels of coercion, collaboration, and in some cases, initiative. The deportations from Western Europe began in earnest in 1942. From France, the first major transports left in March of that year, organized jointly by the German occupation authorities and the Vichy French government. The French police conducted the roundups. The French railway transported the deportees to the German border, where they were handed over to the Reichsbahn. The deportation of French Jews was, in this sense, a collaborative project between two governments and two railway administrations. The system reached its most extreme and revealing expression in Hungary in 1944. By that spring, the war was going catastrophically for Germany. The Red Army was advancing on multiple fronts. Allied forces had landed in Italy and were preparing to cross the Channel. The Reich was contracting. And yet, in May 1944, Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest with a small team and organized the deportation of Hungarian Jews with a speed and efficiency that remains almost incomprehensible. In less than 8 weeks, approximately 437,000 people were deported to Auschwitz on nearly 150 trains. At its peak, 4 trains per day left Hungarian territory for the east. The Reichsbahn managed the routing. Auschwitz expanded its killing capacity to receive them. This was the system at its most rationalized, its most refined. Years of institutional practice had produced processes efficient enough to move nearly 500,000 people to their deaths in less than 2 months, in the final year of a war that was already lost. After the war, the question of accountability fell unevenly and incompletely. Adolf Eichmann was captured by Israeli intelligence in Argentina in 1960 and tried in Jerusalem. He was convicted and executed in 1962. His defense that he was a bureaucrat following orders, that the moral responsibility lay with those above him, was rejected by the court, but has never entirely ceased to resonate as a description of how he experienced his own role. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial for The New Yorker, coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," a formulation that has been debated, refined, and contested ever since, but which pointed towards something genuinely important, that the most systematic evil in modern history was administered not by demons, but by functionaries. The Deutsche Reichsbahn itself was never tried. The institution was dissolved after the war, its assets divided between the railway administrations of East and West Germany. Some individual railway officials faced prosecution, most did not. The men who scheduled the deportation trains returned in many cases to civilian railway work in post-war Germany. The institution moved on. The institutional memory was suppressed. There is a broader lesson here that extends well beyond this specific history. Complex systems, modern bureaucracies, corporations, militaries. Government agencies distribute moral responsibility in ways that make it difficult for any individual to feel fully accountable for collective outcomes. Each person does only their part. Each person can point to those above them who gave the orders, or to those below them who carried them out. The machinery functions because everyone inside it accepts their role as bounded, limited, defined by job description rather than by consequence. This is not an excuse, it is a warning. The Holocaust was unique in its scale and deliberateness, but the institutional dynamics that enabled it, the diffusion of responsibility, the normalization of participation, the bureaucratic insulation of individuals from the consequences of their collective actions, these are not unique to Nazi Germany. They are features of modern institutional life, present wherever large organizations pursue goals that individuals within them might resist if the full picture were made clear. That is why this history matters, beyond its own terrible details. The last deportation trains ran in the autumn of 1944, as Soviet forces closed in on the killing centers in the east, and the SS began frantic efforts to conceal the evidence of what had occurred. The tracks remained, the locomotives were still running, the Reichsbahn continued to function until the final weeks of the Reich, carrying soldiers, refugees and evacuees as the country collapsed around it. When Allied forces reached the camps and the world began to understand what had happened, the natural and necessary response was to frame it as an aberration, as something so extreme, so alien to normal human experience, that it could only be explained as the product of uniquely evil men operating outside the bounds of civilized society. But the trains complicate that framing, because the trains were not outside civilization. They were civilization, its technology, its administration, its logistical capability, its institutional culture. They ran on time. They balanced their books. They followed procedure. The death camps were built at the end of railway lines for a reason, not because the railway was corrupt, but because it worked. And a system that works can be aimed at any destination its operators choose, remembering that refusing to look away from that may be the most important thing this history can teach us. If this kind of rigorous historical analysis matters to you, Steel and Strategy is where that work continues. Subscribing ensures you don't miss it.